In 1789, after the completion of the United States Constitution, Benjamin Franklin said, "Our new Constitution is now established. Everything seems to promise it will be durable. But in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes." We all know that taxes and death are dreadful. We have to pay our taxes, and one can only hope for an interesting and/or happy death. The following people led remarkable lives, and their deaths were also noteworthy. George Washington caught a cold in 1799, and then he was killed. He came back from a riot on his estate on December 12, 1799, and got a sore throat. The next day a doctor was called as his condition worsened. The doctor prescribed the procedure of bloodletting in the belief that by expelling blood, disease and infection would be eliminated. This country's first president was drained of his blood, once in the morning and twice in the afternoon, for a total of 32 ounces of blood. The process actually made him weaker, which led to his death. When he realized he wasn't going to make it, he said of his inevitable death, "The debt which we must all pay." Two of our founding fathers, John Adams, our second president on the left, and Thomas Jefferson, our third president to the right, both died on July 4th, 1846, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had been sick for a year with a urinary tract infection and had been in a death coma when he woke up and asked if it was the 4th of July yet. When he found out that it was only the 3rd, he lingered until the following day and died on July 4th. John Adams died 5 hours later of a heart attack. Chang and Ing Bunker were born on May 11, 1811. Their brothers were born in Siam, which is now known as Thailand. They were brought to the United States in 1829. The conjoined twin brothers became famous as the Siamese twins, which became the term synonymous for conjoined twins. For the next decade, Chang and Ing toured the country and became financially successful and settled near Mount Airy, North Carolina. They became American citizens, married local sisters, and bought slaves. Between the two of them, they fathered 21 children. Chang's and Ing's family lived in two separate houses, taking alternative 3-day stays. The brothers died on January 17, 1874, at the age of 62. One of Ing's sons checked on the sleeping twins. "Uncle Chang is dead," the boy reportedly said to Ing, who responded, "Then I'm going to die." The family doctor was quickly sent for, but Ing soon died, reportedly just 2 hours after his brother's death. An autopsy revealed that their livers were fused in the ligament connecting their sternums. Margaretha Zell was born on August 7, 1876, in the Netherlands. She became known as Mata Hari, the international exotic dancer who cavorted with high-ranking military officers during World War I. In 1904, she was accused of being a spy and charged with treason. During her trial in France, she told the jury that yes, she was a harlot, but a traitoress never. Zell was found guilty and executed by a firing squad of 12 French soldiers just before dawn on October 15, 1917. She was 41 at the time. According to an eyewitness account by the British reporter Henry Wales, she was not bound and refused a blindfold. She defiantly blew a kiss to the firing squad. Her final action angered the main executioner, who shot her once in the head after her body had been riddled by bullets. Mata Hari's body was not claimed by any family members and was accordingly used for medical study. Her head was embalmed and kept in the Museum of Anatomy in Paris. In 2000, archivists discovered that it had disappeared, possibly as early as 1954. Her remains were also missing. Records dated from 1918 show that the museum also received the rest of her body, but none of the remains could later be accounted for either. An assassination that drew international attention in 1923 was that of Mexico's Francisco Pancho Villa. A general in the Mexican Revolution, Villa's infamy was legendary. As a teenager, he joined a group of revolutionaries in the mountains where he became a soldier. In 1912, he narrowly escaped execution by a firing squad with an 11th-hour telegram from President Madero. But in 1923, his luck ran out when Villa was gunned down in the southern state of Chihuahua. As he was being driven down a street in Parral, his car was ambushed by 8 gunmen. He died instantly from 16 bullet wounds, 2 bullets per assassin. Villa was buried in the cemetery in Parral, and 3 years later, grave robbers desecrated his remains and made off with his head. The body of Pancho Villa was disinterred for a second time in 1976 when it was reburied at the Monument to the Revolution in Mexico City. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died on December 5, 1791, at the age of 35. The child prodigy composed many great works, including The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni. The composer was haunted by the prospect of death as he composed a requiem for an anonymous patron. He became ill as he worked and was confined to his bed in November. Mozart was given the last rites on December 4th and died the following day. One of the world's greatest composers died penniless and was buried in a mass grave for paupers. Later, his skull was retrieved and is on display in his birthplace of Salzburg, Austria. The British nobleman Sir Walter Raleigh was sentenced to death for his inability to secure newfound lands and fortunes for the British crown. On October 29, 1618, as he was led to the guillotine, he refused to be blindfolded, which made the executioner nervous. Finally, the condemned man yelled out, "What dost thou fear? Strike, man, strike!" After 2 blows, the deed was done. Sir Walter Raleigh's remains were turned over to his wife, and his body was buried in a church in London. But she had his head embalmed and kept it in a red leather bag next to her for the last 29 years of her life. In 1901, the outlaw Black Jack Ketchum was sentenced to death by hanging in Clayton, New Mexico. 150 tickets had been issued for people to witness his death in a turn of events that no one could have ever imagined. As the trap door of the scaffold opened, the hangman's noose jolted back, severing Ketchum's head from his body. His headless body lay beneath the scaffold, while his head was still hanging in the noose. Black Jack Ketchum's hanging was one of the most horrific examples of capital punishment in this country. Jane Mansfield was the number 2 sexual bombshell after Marilyn Monroe during the mid-20th century. She was decapitated in a car accident in 1967. The car she was riding in slammed into a mosquito truck at 11 o'clock at night in Biloxi, Mississippi. All 3 adults seated in the front were killed. 3 of Mansfield's 5 children in back survived the crash, including Mariska Hargitay, who's known as Detective Olivia Benson, the television star of Law and Order Special Victims Unit. The Russian socialist Leon Trotsky is the last in this series of deadhead stories. He was bludgeoned to death with a pickaxe by an agent working for his nemesis, Joseph Stalin, in 1940. Living in exile in Mexico City after numerous attempts on his life, Trotsky met his end on August 21, 1940, when a man who had befriended him snuck a pickaxe in his raincoat and struck his head from behind while Trotsky read in his office. Instead of collapsing, Trotsky jumped up from his desk and ran through his house screaming, He remained conscious at the hospital. As the nurse began to cut his clothes to prepare him for surgery, he told his wife, "I do not want them to undress me. I want you to undress me." Soon after, he fell into a coma and died 24 hours later. The United States refused to admit his body for burial, so Trotsky was cremated and buried outside of Mexico City. Christopher Columbus did a lot of traveling even after his death. After his triumphant discovery of America in 1492, he began to lose favor with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who granted him license to discover the New World. By 1504, after several more voyages, Columbus had failed to bring the promised gold to the coffers of the Spanish crown. At 58, Columbus suffered from heart disease and was physically and psychologically drained. He died a dejected man. The famous explorer took his last breath in Spain on May 1st, 1506. His body was taken to Seville for burial, but in 1536 it was disinterred and his bones were shipped to a cathedral in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, which he had also discovered. When France took over the island in the late 1700s, the remains of Columbus were moved to Havana, Cuba. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, Columbus went on yet another voyage back to Seville in southern Spain, where his remains remain, for now anyway. Jimi Hendrix overdosed on September 18, 1970. When Janis Joplin heard of his sudden death, she said, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." 3 weeks later, on October 4th, 1970, Joplin was dead of an overdose. This month is the 50th anniversary of Joplin's death. Bessie Smith is considered the greatest blues singer of all time. While on tour, she was killed in a car accident in Memphis. An ambulance was called to the scene, and when it arrived, it took her to a hospital for blacks that was several miles away. The singer could have been taken to a hospital for whites that was closer, but she wouldn't have been admitted. She died of her injuries at the Hospital for Blacks in Clarksdale, Mississippi, on September 26, 1937. Bessie Smith was buried in Philadelphia in a gold-trimmed casket, but it would be another 33 years before she received a tombstone. The cost of the tombstone was covered by her former maid and her biggest fan, Janis Joplin. The tombstone was installed on August 7, 1970, with the engraving, "The greatest blues singer in the world will never stop singing, Bessie Smith." 2 months later, Janis Joplin died of a heroin overdose. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, and that's when his career really took off. In fact, the repackaging of his hit songs, tours of his home at Graceland, and the Elvis conventions and the mementos bearing his image made more money than he did when he was alive. More than 80,000 fans went to Graceland to see Elvis as he laid in state. The National Guard was on duty to keep order. One man had a heart attack while a woman went into labor as they waited to see the king of rock and roll. Elvis t-shirts were being sold outside the mansion for $5. Elvis the Pelvis, as he was often called, died from drugs and an unhealthy lifestyle. But his death invigorated his career for eternity. 3 other singers found success after their untimely deaths in a plane crash. On February 3, 1959, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper were killed in a plane crash in Clear Lake, Iowa. The trio were on tour and had the bad luck of being chartered by an inexperienced pilot in the dead of winter. Buddy Holly found fame with his hits "That'll Be the Day" and "Peggy Sue." He was 22 when he died. Ritchie Valens became famous with his hit song "La Bamba." He was only 17 at the time of the crash. The Big Bopper of Chantilly Lace fame was 28, the oldest of the trio at the time of the crash. Their music has been featured in movies and continues to be played on the airways, finding generations of new fans for over 60 years. Another rock and roll plane crash that occurred on October 20th, 1977, seemed to be preordained. The rhythm and blues band Lynyrd Skynyrd, that had the hit song Sweet Home Alabama, lost two band members in the crash. A total of 6 people were killed, while 20 other crew members were injured. A week before the crash, the band had released their fourth album, Street Survivors. The album cover featured the band members surrounded by flames. One of the songs on the album was entitled That Smell, which featured the chorus, "Oh, oh, that smell, the smell of death's around you." When the crash occurred, 500,000 copies of the album had been sold. The remaining copies were pulled from the shelves and replaced with the 7 band members standing against a black background instead of the fiery original cover. A premonition of impending death occurred for the Southwestern photographer Ben Wittick. In 1903, at Fort Wingate near Gallup, a Hopi medicine man said his death was imminent. He died the following day of a rattlesnake bite. Death was in the cards for Wild Bill Hickok. The infamous lawman had many scrapes with death. In fact, he even got to read about it. In 1873, he wrote a letter to the St. Louis, Missouri Democrat to correct the news of his passing. But fate has a way of catching up with you when you least expect it. On August 2nd, 1876, Wild Bill Hickok was partaking in a friendly poker game when he was shot in the back of the head. The bullet exited his right cheek and found its way into the wrist of a poker player seated across from Hickok. Wild Bill slumped onto the table, clutching his hand of aces and eights, which is known as the dead man's hand. In 1939, at the age of 22, Manolete was hailed as the greatest matador of his time. The Spaniard was born into the profession. His father, grandfather, uncles, and great-uncles were all bullfighters. There were statues erected in his honor, as well as a song and even a liqueur named for Manolete. During his career, he killed hundreds of bulls and was gored by a few as he toured Spain, Mexico, and South America. But when he turned the ripe old age of 30, fate caught up with the famous matador. On August 28, 1947, he had finally met his match and was seriously gored, but not before he managed to administer the final stab to the bull. As he was rushed to the hospital, the bull collapsed in the arena and died. While still conscious, Manolete was presented with the bull's ears and tail, the traditional honor of a well-fought match. Early the next morning, as he was receiving his 5th blood transfusion, Manolete died. One newspaper reported, "He killed dying and died killing." Talcott Harmon Parkhurst, seen here standing, wasn't a matador, but he was also gored by a bull and died from those injuries. The New Mexico photographer had the bad luck of running across a bull while on assignment in the 1940s. He didn't die right away, but he was forced to close his photo studio and move to California to be close to his daughter, where he ultimately died from the injuries sustained by the attack from the bull. The Santa Fe photographer Tyler Dinghy was the brother-in-law of the artist Will Schuster, who was the co-creator of Zozobra. In 1960, his photo of the Palace of the Governors was adopted by the U.S. Postal Service as the official stamp commemorating the 350th anniversary of Santa Fe. The following year, he was struck by lightning while fishing with Schuster in Estes, Colorado. Both Dinghy's Cocker Spaniel and Schuster's Poodle were also killed by the thunderbolt. Rudolph Valentino was considered the greatest lover of the silent film era in Hollywood. From 1921 until his sudden death in 1926 at the age of 31, Valentino had captured the hearts of women near and far. His death from a ruptured appendix sent the world into a tailspin. As he lay dying in the hospital, Valentino received thousands of telegrams and hundreds of Bibles, flowers, and rosaries. As he lay in state, 90,000 people paid their last respects. Valentino was placed in a silver bronze coffin with a glass plate covering his body. His head had been turned toward the mourners to give a full-face view of the beloved idol. More than 20,000 people jammed the streets of New York to catch a glimpse of Rudolph Valentino's funeral procession. The funeral mass took place at St. Malachy's Church, which today continues to be the church for actors. The legendary escape artist Harry Houdini couldn't escape death all because of a sucker punch. Houdini attracted throngs of fans as he was locked and bound in chains and thrown into rivers or dangled from skyscrapers. To the amazement of his audience, he would always manage to break free of his bondage at the last breathtaking moment. After one of his performances, a young man punched Houdini in the gut without warning and busted his appendix. Although he was in great pain, Houdini managed to perform at the sold-out show and was then rushed to the hospital, where he died on October 31st, 1926. Before he died, he made his wife promise that whoever died first, that they would come back from the dead to make contact. That turned out to be an eerie request, since Houdini died on Halloween. President William Henry Harrison has the unique distinction of being the president for a month. The inauguration of the 68-year-old took place on March 4, 1841. It was a cold and windy day as the new president rode down Pennsylvania Avenue on his favorite horse. He wore no coat for the frosty occasion, and since he waved his hat to the crowds, it provided little protection from the elements. President Harrison developed a severe cold a few days after being sworn in, which led to a high fever and delirium. He died on April 4th, 1 month to the day of his inauguration. On April 15th, 1912, the Titanic crashed into an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland in the North Atlantic and sank. The luxury steamship was on its maiden voyage from Southampton in Britain to New York. Some of the wealthiest people in the world embarked on the ship's first and only Atlantic crossing. Of the 2,435 passengers on board, 1,500 lost their lives. 12 dogs accompanied their wealthy owners on the trip. These 3 are the only ones that survived. Jerome Irving Rodale advocated for people's well-being through exercise and healthy living, which he showcased in the magazines he published at Rodale Press. He also practiced what he preached by exercising and maintaining an exclusive diet of organic food. In an interview with the New York Times, the 72-year-old said he was going to live to be 100 because of his healthy lifestyle. A few days later, on June the 7th, 1971, he appeared on the Dick Cavett Show. After he was interviewed, Cavett proceeded to interview the next guest. Rodale closed his eyes and Cavett thought he had fallen asleep, but he had actually died of a heart attack. The taping of that Dick Cavett Show was never aired. Rodale's sudden demise brought new meaning to the Hollywood phrase, fade to black.